Não importa o desafio, não importa o adversário, você vai estar sempre pronto.
Hey guys, it's Andrew, and in this video I'll be breaking down a few clips of Brazilian MMA legend Anderson Silva speaking in Portuguese, using Spanish as a bridge to help us decode his words, as well as gain a better understanding of the spoken Portuguese language. In this first clip, Anderson talks about why he accepted an offer to move up a weight class to fight the light heavyweight champion Daniel Cormier on 2 days' notice.
Mas a grande lição e o que eu realmente queria naquele momento era sentir se aquele espírito de guerreiro estava em mim ainda, sabe?
First, he says, mas a grande lição, but the big lesson, pero la gran lección. Spanish words that end in ion, like lección, usually have a really similar Portuguese equivalent ending in ão, like lição. For example, emoción is emoção in Portuguese, opción, opção, relación, relação, and so on. To make them plural, the ão usually becomes ões. So emoção becomes emoções, opção becomes opções, and relação becomes relações. And just like the ion words in Spanish, these words are feminine in Portuguese, which is why he uses the feminine definite article a grande lição, la gran lección. One thing to notice here is that unlike how grande becomes gran when placed before a singular noun in Spanish, in Portuguese, grande never changes. Then he says, e o que eu realmente queria naquele momento, and what I really wanted in that moment, y lo que realmente querían en aquel momento. The first thing that I want to talk about in this phrase is the pronunciation of the word realmente. If a word starts with an R in Portuguese, then it's pronounced like an H, as in realmente. The legendary Gracie family who started Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is famous for having names starting with R. Notice the pronunciation. Royce, Rickson, Renzo, Ralph. Then the second syllable in realmente, the AL is pronounced with an AU sound. Realmente. So even in English, we call the Brazilian currency the real. In Brazil, it's called the real. Then the last part of the word is pronounced mente, not mente, since the TE at the end of the words is always pronounced chi. So one more time, comparing the two, realmente in Spanish versus realmente in Portuguese. And then quería is the imperfect of the verb querer, just like in Spanish, only without the accent on the I. Naquele is a contraction of en and aquele, or the equivalent of en aquel in Spanish. Naquele momento, in that moment, en aquel momento. So Anderson's saying that what he really wanted in that moment when he accepted the fight was to era sentir se aquele espírito de guerreiro estava em mim ainda, was to feel if that warrior spirit was still in me. Era sentir si aquel espíritu de guerrero estaba en mí todavía. Era is the imperfect of the verb ser, just like in Spanish. And as you probably guessed, sentir is to feel. Notice how the en in Portuguese is pronounced en, like it's got a G attached to it, not en like in Spanish. So it's sentir. Just as with the TE, the TI in Portuguese is pronounced chi. Se aquele espírito de guerreiro, beginning with espírito, spirit. Words ending in TO are pronounced with the U sound like espírito, oito, 8 or ocho in Spanish, and rato, mouse or ratón. Then the equivalent of the Spanish de is G, spelled the same way but pronounced with the J sound as in the English word judge. And guerrero or warrior in Portuguese is guerreiro, the double R is pronounced with an H sound. Other examples of this would be the word for car, carro, and land, terra. Estava is the imperfect of the verb estar, like estaba in Spanish. Notice how he said tava, though not estava. This is something that I covered in my spoken Portuguese tips video. It's that in casual speech, the es in the verb estar in all its forms is almost never pronounced. And then em mim ainda, still in me, or en mí todavía. Pay close attention to the pronunciation. Em mim ainda. Each of these words has what's called a nasal sound, which, as we saw earlier with the words grande, momento, realmente, and sentir, has this ng quality to it, like em and in. As a rule of thumb, whenever you see a vowel followed by an M or N, you'll be pronouncing it with this nasal sound. These nasal sounds are really what make Portuguese sound so unique and different from Spanish. So mastering them is really key to making you sound as authentic as possible. A lot of people consider Brazilian Portuguese one of the most beautiful languages. Let me know in the comments what it is that you feel makes it sound so beautiful. In the next clip, Anderson talks about why the martial arts means so much to him.
E a arte marcial é uma coisa muito especial, cara. Porque quando você tem a essência marcial, não importa o desafio, não importa o adversário, você vai estar sempre pronto.
So first he says, a arte marcial é uma coisa muito especial. Literally, the martial art is a very special thing. This is an example of the tendency in spoken Brazilian Portuguese to use the singular when talking about generalities with a plural meaning. So instead of using the plural as artes marciais to talk about martial arts in general, he uses the singular, a arte marcial, the martial art. If this interview was conducted for, let's say, a magazine article, then they'd probably use the plural since that's considered the more correct way in formal written Portuguese. As artes marciais são uma coisa muito especial, which in Spanish would be las artes marciales son una cosa muy especial. Then he goes, porque quando você tem a essência marcial, because when you have the martial essence, as in the essence of the martial arts, porque cuando tienes la esencia marcial, notice the difference between the Portuguese quando and the Spanish cuando. You should hear the nasal sound in the Portuguese quando since you have a vowel followed by an N. When you say cuando in Spanish, your tongue touches the upper part of the mouth when you say the first syllable, quan. Whereas in Portuguese, your tongue never hits the upper part of the mouth when you say the quan in quando. And just as we saw earlier how words ending in to, like espírito, are pronounced with a U sound, the same goes for words ending in do, like quando. Then você tem means you have. Tem being the third person singular conjugation of the verb ter. Even though você is now the general word for you in Portuguese, it takes on verbs in the third person singular just like usted does in Spanish. Não importa o desafio, no matter the challenge, no importa el desafío. Anytime you see an S between vowels, like in desafio, it'll sound like a Z, like we saw earlier in the word coisa. Não importa o adversário, no matter the opponent. No importa el oponente. Você vai estar sempre pronto. You're always going to be ready. Vas a estar siempre listo. Notice how he drops the ES in estar and just says ta. The last thing I want to point out is that the R at the end of infinitive verbs like está is usually silent. Most Brazilians will not pronounce it. For example, cantar, cortar, esperar. So in summary, Anderson is basically saying he took the fight on such short notice against a tough opponent because he wanted to test himself. He wanted to see if he still had it in him. And he says that if you have the essence of the martial arts within you, you'll always be ready. Thank you guys for watching. If you haven't already downloaded my guide, Your First Conversations in Portuguese, you can get it by clicking on the link in the description. It's based on my first 2 videos teaching you basic Portuguese conversation, and it's meant to be a practical guide to get you speaking Portuguese right away as you make the switch from Spanish. If you enjoyed this video, let me know by hitting that like button and subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Muito obrigado e até a próxima. Tchau.